this is a short tutorial on how to use the gridding method to transfer an image from one place to another place. So in this case, we're copying our photo at the same size onto this piece of paper. It can also be used to change the size of something, in which case you would have you would change the size of the grid. So if you wanted to do a mural of this, you might have 1 inch gridding here and then have a wall where the grids were a foot by a foot. All right, so for this example though, you can see how this is started. We're going to start from the beginning. So we have our image again, and we have the piece of paper that we're going to transfer it onto. The paper that I'm using, I printed out from a website, and it has the words www.printablepaper.net right here. This is really important to pay attention to where you're orienting that on your paper. So I've got my paper oriented all the way to this bottom left corner, which makes the words right here, and they are readable, they're not reversed. So when I put my grid on my image, I want to make sure that the words are in the same place, they're not reversed, so that we will have everything matching up. Because as you see, these grids are not perfectly even on all sides. So if you have your grid oriented differently, it would mess up the whole procedure. All right, so pay attention to where those words are and how they're oriented and which corner you have this aligned with. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my marks following what's on the grid. So I want to make sure this is perfectly lined up. And then I'm going to put my pencil. I'm using a light pencil, so you would use your 4B, your lightest pencil. And I would pretend to make a mark here and then just follow that up right onto the paper, making a light mark. And then I'm going to follow that procedure. So it's really important that this be done as accurately as possible. In the past, when I've done this same type of assignment with classes, the thing that people messed up on the most was just copying their grid, and then that would mess up the next steps of the assignment. You would have to redo it. So just really take your time and do this as accurately and carefully as you possibly can. All right, so again, make sure that everything's still lined up. Now, the next step, I'm going to make marks for the bottom part of the grid. So again, I need to make sure that this is lined up, but now I'm just moving it up a little bit. So it's lined up over here on this side of the paper, and I'm going to follow this and just go down like so. Actually making that just a little bit lower. Now one thing that I'm noticing with this particular grid, these were photocopied, and sometimes when the paper goes through the photocopier, sometimes it goes through completely straight, sometimes it goes through a little bit crooked. So the grid on this, I think, is just maybe a little bit crooked. So that's not going to matter as long as we're just copying it accurately. It'll mean that the grid that we draw on here, it'll sort of have a frame where it's a little bit crooked. As long as we are using this same grid on our paper and then on our photo, it won't cause any problems. All right, so now I just want to make sure, double check, these should all be exactly lined up, just like they were on the top. So we're going to be connecting them. Now that said, before we connect them, we're going to do the same type of procedure with the lines that go from side to side. So again, make sure, I almost didn't have it lined up in the corner. So before I keep going, before you keep going, make sure you have this lined up perfectly. I'm just drawing these lines, little marks. Okay, and then I'm going to slide this over. And this time I want to make sure that it's still perfectly lined up on the bottom. And I'm going to follow these marks over. In carpentry, they have a saying, measure twice, cut once. So we are going to take that same principle. We're going to check our marks before we try to match them up. So we're going to make sure that these are lined up and that these are done just right. So if they're a little bit off, just go ahead and you can remark. And make sure you keep going and check all of these before we connect them. All right, looks like these all line up just right. Okay, so once you've checked everything, then you're going to take your ruler and take your light pencil again. So eventually all of these grid lines are going to disappear. We're going to erase them before we add any shading. So to do that, you're going to need to make sure that the lines are really light to begin with. So I think for a lot of us, our habit is to just press really hard when we're using a ruler. So resist the temptation. Remind yourself you're going to make this light line. Make this line as light as possible while still visible. And make sure, again, that you're just doing this as accurately as possible. So if you don't get your mark just right, just where you want it, then make sure that you go back and erase and just do it again. All right, I'll pause the video while I finish that up. Okay, so I continued connecting those marks. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my marks going from side to side. So again, just make sure that you are doing this really carefully and keep your lines really light. All right, so I'll continue that going down. And again, if any of these go askew, just take a moment to pause, erase, and redo the line as needed. Okay, so I finished that up off camera. There were a few little places where I had to try again, where my ruler slipped, so I would just touch those up as needed. All right, and then I am getting close to being ready to grid. All right, so first I'm going to make sure, again, that I have the words lined up in the same place as I did when I was doing my grid over here. And in fact, I am going to use the exact same grid paper. So if my grid paper was like a little bit crooked, which I think it is, then I'll have that same crookedness in the exact same way on the image that I'm going to use. All right. So next thing I'm going to do is label these squares. So I'm going to create my label at the top. I'm going to choose to use letters. And it's nice that we have a little bit of extra room here because I've got 9 by 12 drawing paper. And it's 8.5 by 11 is the standard sheet for a printer. So I've got a little bit of room. I can just do that above where the grid's going to be. And then on this side, I'm going to do numbers. And I'm going to put my numbers eventually right here in the white spot. So I'm going to do that really, really close to where this is. So I guess I'll include this one up here, even though it's really small. So 1, 2, I'm going to do that in the middle. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then this little tiny bottom one is 10. And I'm going to match the lettering and numbering on here. So I do have to remove this and kind of guess a little bit and get these in the right spot. So that's why I want to do them right in the middle. So A, B, C, etc. Okay, so when I put this back down, I've got my letters centered enough so that they're in the right corresponding parts. Just slide this over a little bit to do the numbering. All right, so I'm going to number even this little one at the top because it's what I did on my paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, including that little tiny one down at the bottom. Okay, so now we're basically copying whatever is in each of these squares onto the matching square. All right, so our letters and numbers are so that we can easily match up the squares. So first thing I'm going to do, well, before I do anything else, I'm going to make sure that my translucent sheet is lined up again correctly on here. If you need to, you can even tape this on, but I find that it sticks with the materials I'm using just because it's static. All right, so we've got this like little 10 down here, 10A, and this is going to seem silly, but it's going to mess us up if we don't do it. This little square down here has just this little sliver of gray, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy that. And you just have to pay attention to proportions here. So is this line, you know, halfway down, or is it a little closer to the grid line? Oh, it's a little closer to the grid line. You know, where is this line over here of the gray? Is it halfway? No, it's definitely closer to the edge of the page. So if I follow that on up, I can go square by square, although this is pretty simple, so I don't really have to. And the very first thing I'm going to do is just copy in this white area. Because, speaking from experience, if you don't do this, you will forget that it's there, you'll forget to factor it in, and then it's going to throw off your proportions as you're looking at whatever else is going on in that square. All right, and then now I'm in this A1 spot, so looking at that, where does that line up? And remember, we are kind of pretending that these go all the way to the edge there, so if you need to, if that pretending is throwing you off, you could even extend that. So that's, because it does, those grid lines go all the way to the edge of my paper. So then that just goes a little bit above and continues. All right, and so if we follow that same idea, we're just going to continue and draw in this rectangle before we do anything else. And that is the area that your actual drawing is happening in. All right, so when you come to the end, I'm on L and 10. And you are going to kind of have to look, and you can, if you want to, This part you can just make sure you have it in the exact right place by tracing it on, saying, okay, this is exactly where the paper ends. So that's going to be the end of the grid there. And then within that, again, if I look at each of these little squares, then I'm going to also draw in where exactly does the end of that gray area, the photo within the paper. So this is the end of my paper right there, and then this is the end of the gray area. All right, and so this was pretty simple, but this kind of gives you an idea of what you're really going to be doing for the entire drawing. So up here, I didn't actually give this an end of the paper up here, which I should have, so I'll do that too. All right, and then we can see, all right, this is where that edge of the photo is in proportion with the edge of the paper. So we've got this kind of white border all the way around our photo. All right, and from there, we're just going to kind of continue that process. So down here at the very bottom, again, I'm going to make sure that I line this up. All right, and you want it lined up really exactly. We want to pay attention to even the smallest little details. I'm going to see, okay, this is 10, and then this is going to be B9, basically, is where I start to see a line happening in my image. So I'm going to look, where does that connect? Okay, it's going to be right in the corner, and I'm going to look at that angle. You can even do things as small as, oh, okay, there's like a little bump there in the line, so I'm copying that edge. And again, you want to think about, okay, where does that line cross this part of the grid? Oh, it's just a little bit to the side of half. So as you're trying to figure that kind of thing out, I'm often mentally and sometimes even physically kind of dividing up squares into smaller, like quarters, to figure out where are these lines going to fall. Then I'm moving up to this square up here, and I'm looking, okay, I'm going to copy this line. It kind of does roughly this, and then I can go back and I can say, oh, okay, but there's actually like a little bump, and then another little bump. So the more you try to get that detail, the more accurate your drawing is going to be. But feel free, you can kind of like first look at that overall angle, and then kind of add in the smaller details from there, kind of like what we did when we did our underdrawing first. And then from there, so I've got this outside, but I've also got this lighter line here. That's just going to be a fold in the cloth. And I can also kind of look and try to understand what's happening with the shapes and forms. So this is kind of a seam in the cloth that's bumping out. So that can also help make your drawing more accurate. So gridding, just like when we were doing tracing earlier, yeah, theoretically anyone can trace, but the more you know about form and interior line, the better your tracing of your photograph actually is going to be. So the same thing goes here too. So I'm going to see, oh, there's another tiny little line there, that edge of the seam. And I'm going to copy that in as well. So again, and then in this like next little square, I can see, oh, this actually cuts through that little tiny corner. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to see, oh, okay, and then I've got this kind of curve or angle, and where does that end? It's a little bit down from the center, so I can kind of roughly copy that, and then I can add in any more sort of like precise details or variations. I can also see, oh, okay, there's like a line there going over it that's like a piece of my hair, and then this other part like above it. So I'm already looking to see those details. I can even put in these like little tiny holes in the lace if I want to. So That may be a little bit too much, but if you want to, you can, because just going square by square, it does allow for that realism. Notice I'm drawing really lightly, so I'm still going to make mistakes even with the gridding, so I still want to make sure that I draw lightly so I can go back and make changes. So that's basically the idea. The first go around, what I'll usually do is just do kind of the outlines. So if you see a shape like this kind of has like a bit of a soft edge there, it's a shadow, but I would just sort of roughly go around what I think the shape is. If I see a shadow, I could even kind of like outline both sides of the shadow a little bit. And then after I do kind of my outlines of everything, then I'm going to erase the grids and start to add the shading. And you guys are going to be allowed to use different materials depending on what you want to do.